And ultimately, I think if you can give people a strong sense of purpose to articulate why you're there beyond just earning another fraction of a cent of EPS every quarter, what you're trying to do to improve the world. I think people thrive on a sense of purpose. I think people need to have a sense of autonomy where they can guide their own day, they can guide their own work, they can learn from it, and they can choose how they do the work. And then finally, the sense of mastery that people want to get good at what they're doing.
Welcome to the LearnOps Leadership Series. I'm your host, Ryan Austin, CEO of Synapse. Today, I have the pleasure of interviewing Jon Kaplan. He's a Senior Learning and Development Executive, the former Chief Learning Officer of Discover Financial. Welcome, Jon.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm really excited to host you. You and I talked a little bit before this, but I always like to start off and just learning about people's story. I'm super curious, Jon, even to learn about how you got into learning and development.
Yeah, sure. So I didn't think I was going to go into learning and development. I thought I was going to go into academe. I thought I was going to be a professor of something. And I found out that I really hated academe. It just I was doing advanced degree in international policy, and just the more I was in that field, the more it occurred to me that in order to get published, in order to get accolades in academia, you had to do something that no one else had ever done before, which meant that it was less and less top of mind, less and less relevant. It's to some extent less and less important. And so I ended up realizing that just academe wasn't for me because it wasn't going to tackle big problems. And I think that tackling big problems is something that just academe itself often doesn't do well, because it's just all incentivized around finding a very specific niche that no one else has ever thought of before. So, but what I did love about academia is I loved the opportunity to teach and mentor undergraduates. So as I was getting my advanced degree, I was a lecturer in international policy and taught undergraduates about international relations theory and monetary policy and economic policy and the European Union, all sorts of things like that. And what I found really awesome was just that one-on-one time talking to people and seeing the light bulbs go off when they made connections that they hadn't made before. And that's what got me inspired about learning.
Oh, amazing. And so what was the first kind of role that you crossed into? I know that you've held roles within L&D at Visa, Oracle, Discover Financial that we talked about. So what what made you cross the line, and what was the first door that opened up for you to introduce you to corporate L&D?
Yeah, so initially, I mean, I have these two aspects of my career. One is something that focuses on social good, and one that's around learning and development. And so I started my career as a high school teacher. I got a single subject teaching credential in social studies and went to teach economics and government at Skyline High in Oakland, California. And I did that for a while. Ended up moving and teaching American history and teaching some literature. And then one day when I was, gosh, it must have been my third year, the superintendent from the school district came in my room when I was grading papers and said, "Hey, my understanding is I need to get to know you." And I thought, well, okay, that could either mean one of two things, and it could be either good or bad. It turned out to be good, and he actually wanted to put me in charge of a charter school that the district was launching with Arthur Andersen, the accounting firm. And they had negotiated an agreement to launch a school of the future with Arthur Andersen. Arthur Andersen came and put $1.5 million into the school district for the creation of this school, and the district matched it, and then they staffed it with a bunch of teachers, and I was sort of the lead facilitator. And so one of the things that taught me is, one, there's just the classroom model of education looks like it creates some certainty for teachers at least, but it actually doesn't do a good job of creating a learning environment. And the learning environment we created at the Arthur Anderson Community Learning Center, which is what it was called, was entirely based around project-based learning, and it was all self-directed learning. It was 7th through 12th graders, and it was about 150 students, but all of their projects were defined by themselves. There were no classrooms. They were given some resources, and their challenge was to create a constructivist way of making it through the learning and demonstrating proficiency at each level of the state mandated framework for curriculum. And so, we had our successes, we had plenty of failures as well, but ultimately it taught me that there was a better model for learning.
Interesting. And going from teaching students in academia to then corporate, I mean, was that a big jump? Was there a lot of different changes from one to the other?
Yeah, it was a huge jump. I mean, for me, at some point I realized that the Arthur Anderson Community Learning Center wasn't a replicable model and wasn't going to be just stamped out one after another. I really wanted to change the face of education, and I realized at some point that just the way this model was progressing wasn't aligned to my ambitions. And so I decided that the most interesting things in education were going on in the corporate sector, because they were really thinking about how online training and how the internet was going to change the face of education. And so I left the high school and the high school district that I was working at, and ended up getting a job as a curriculum designer for PeopleSoft Incorporated, which was one of the early big enterprise software companies. And I was actually writing training manuals for software development tools. So all of the software developers that we hired had to go through, my course on how to design and build applications. And so that was a really good immersion into technology and how to teach people technology and how to teach them coding skills. And I eventually worked my way up through the hierarchy there. Ended up running all of the supply chain management curriculum that PeopleSoft had, and eventually I moved to I moved to Denver when PeopleSoft purchased a company in Denver and ran a big division out there.
Interesting. So, I mean, that's really inspiring because going from curriculum designer to ultimately a chief learning officer, I mean, there's a lot of upskilling and up-leveling that you probably went through yourself to go from, designing solutions to running a business, right? And helping to manage learning and development at a operating level of scale. Um, if you looked at yourself as the CLO giving advice back to that curriculum designer, what are some of uh, the lessons learned would you have shared back then?
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe the first lesson is just be at the right place at the right time. I mean, there's a lot of luck that's involved, and it's easy to look back and say, gosh, I made so many great decisions, and ultimately, I made my fair share of good decisions, but I happened to be in the right place at the right time a lot of the time, and I was very lucky. I had my girlfriend, now my wife, was working at Oracle, and I actually always thought I was going to go work at Oracle. I thought Oracle was a wonderful company, and they actually ended up acquiring PeopleSoft. I ended up working there. But back when I was a high school teacher, her boss, who was a vice president at Oracle, sat down and had a career conversation with me when I was probably 24, and I just that was unique to me. No one had ever talked to me about my career, and just he helped me uncover some things about my own values and how they align to public being a public school teacher, and how they might align to being in the corporate sector. And that was always something that, I mean, there's no reason in the world why he should have spent time with me, but he did, and that's something that I always think about. That so I look for opportunities to mentor people early in their careers, because I received some early mentorship that was just invaluable. I'd also say I was a curriculum designer at age 35 probably. That's when I started. So I missed about 10 years in the corporate sector by being a high school teacher. And what that did is I came into the environment with just mismatched skills. On the one hand, I think I had really good communication and conflict resolution skills, all those things that you need for dealing with teenagers, many of whom have a lot of troubles learning in the traditional learning environment. But really, like how a company worked, I had no idea. I mean, I just couldn't tell you. What does the finance department do? What is a controller? I mean, I had no idea sort of the underlying economic, sort of machinery of a company. So I went back. I got my MBA at the Haas School of Business at the University of California at Berkeley, and that was really helpful to me at a time when I knew how to deal with people, but I didn't know how to deal. I didn't know how to deal with work essentially, and how do you organize and structure work in a way so that it adds to the bottom line is something that took me a while to learn.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I would agree that luck plays out a lot into these things, but there's that saying, 10% luck, 90% hard work. And I think just by you talking about how you realized the gap that was holding you back to achieve greatness in the workforce and going and taking that step forward to doing your MBA to bridge the gaps. I mean, I think that plays into the luck part as well. So, I mean, that's really interesting to hear about. So, you learned more about business and and you're a curriculum designer. You now have this business context by the book. How did you start applying that into the workplace? What were the next opportunities that then helped you to create that luck to continue to move upwards to eventually becoming a chief learning officer?
Well, one of the things that I sort of, one of my early guiding sort of philosophies was that um, in times of instability, people with talent make disproportional gains. And I always looked for opportunities when there's a lot of instability because I felt an environment in which I could succeed. So I tried to move myself into positions of responsibility in some of the most unstable environments. Sometimes when there was a new leader who came in and had decided that they were going to reorg, when there was an acquisition, I always tried to get into those environments because I felt that that was the type of environment where there was the most open space. And in open space, I think people with talent distinguish themselves. So that was one of the reasons why I moved my family to Denver in gosh, it must have been the early 2000s. There was our company had bought another company, and they were looking for someone to lead a bunch of the work there. And I talked about it with my wife, and she's like, "I'd love to live in Denver." So I went, and we moved to Denver. And honestly, I knew no one in Denver at the time, and we moved there. And it took a risk. And I think the thing is, if you're confident in yourself, take a lot of risks early in your career. That's one of the advice that I give to people, especially early in their career. Later in their career, the calculus changes, and there's less time to recover from bad luck. So typically, people as they get older later in their career, there's less reason to take big risks. But early in your career, take a bunch of big risks.
Yeah, no, that, and I agree. I mean, as an entrepreneur, I have this saying, it's actually a value at Synapse to embrace uncertainty. And you learn the most when you're the most uncomfortable. And as humans, you tend to just adapt and figure things out. So by throwing yourself in the deep end, you're going to learn how to swim, right? And so there's a lot of lessons that from that as well that played into your good luck that you talked about earlier, which I'm starting to think that it's less good luck and like taking risks and putting yourself out there and learning where there was gaps and having the wisdom to be able to do that and actually go and do that, right? So
Ryan, there's you probably listen to this podcast. This is a podcast that I just love. It's called How I Built This with Guy Raz, and it's interviews with entrepreneurs and founders. And at the end of every interview, he asks the same question, which is, hey, you've been very successful. How much of it is your skill and ability, and how much of it is luck? And pretty much everyone stumbles into the same answer. And the answer they typically give is it's neither. It's persistence. And there's one of the founders of a company called Essential Oils basically said, we're not good business people, we're good not going out of business people. And ultimately, if you can stick around, you can be there when the good luck comes your way. You're gonna see your a normal distribution of good luck and bad luck, and the key is to withstand the bad luck so you're there to take advantage of the good luck. And I think maybe that was, some level of persistence that throughout my career I've tried to be in places where they're and be there for the good luck. Not necessarily that I was created the luck, but I put myself in situations where when there was good luck, I could capitalize on it.
Hmm. No, it's inspiring. Now, there was a cover story in the CLO magazine on humanity and humility. Can you tell us more about that? Because I have a feeling that it plays into these life lessons that you've learned along the way.
Yeah, you know, I think I was just very blessed to be the subject of that article, and I'm very grateful for all the events that transpired around that. And the reporter went and talked to some people, and that was the way they categorized it as this a career of humility and sort of trying to create a humane environment and a humane culture. Ultimately, I think that a lot of the attributes of the modern day American corporation are pretty inhumane. And if you think about it, I mean, this idea that like you have to take your entire population of workers and essentially threaten them with some sort of sanctions if they don't produce at a high level and don't do whatever they're supposed to. I mean, that to me strikes me as not the kind of place I really want to work. And I've always inspired by someone like Daniel Pink, who I don't know if you've read the book Drive, but it's one of my the canon that I go to around leadership. Drive is around what motivates people. And basically, Daniel Pink came up with three things. It's a combination of the strive for mastery, the strive for autonomy, and the strive for purpose. And ultimately, I think if you can give people a strong sense of purpose to articulate why you're there beyond just earning another fraction of a cent of EPS every quarter, what you're trying to do to improve the world. I think people thrive on a sense of purpose. I think people need to have a sense of autonomy where they can guide their own day, they can guide their own work, they can learn from it, and they can choose how they do the work. And then finally, the sense of mastery, that people want to get good at what they're doing. And honestly, I think that if you create an environment that has all three elements of that, you can largely remove the sense of threat from your environment. And like when you think about it, people who are not inspired by a sense of purpose, people who do not have a sense of autonomy, and people who are not achieving a level of mastery, they want to move on. I mean, they're not inspired by the work they're doing. And I think to the extent that you can help them understand where they can be successful, you don't have to threaten people. And so, I guess that's the sense of humanity. Like, how do you create a culture and environment in a company where people don't feel a fear of sort of arbitrary retaliation from a set of corporate metrics that may not align to sort of the work that they do on a day-to-day basis.
Interesting. And so let's fast forward. Now you take a position as Chief Learning Officer at Discover Financial. Um, and what was interesting to me was that when reading your background, you reported on financial business outcomes and cost savings to the business as a CLO, but also really prided the work that your team did on enabling great learning experiences to drive those outcomes. And you're also working in environments like call center operations and whatnot, which are tough environments to work in for some people as well. Um, what were some of the things coming into Discover Financial that you looked at the organization from a learning perspective and said, okay, these are some of the foundational frameworks that we need to put in place to run a really strong learning environment?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, first of all, we um, maybe the way to think about sort of the call center environment is that the training organization was at least when I showed up, was a step in the career progression of a call center agent. So a call center agent would come in, maybe 19, 20 years old, maybe a little bit of college, a high school diploma, but not very much college, and they would start as a call center agent. And then if they were really good, they would maybe become a coach and they would help other call center agents. And then perhaps they could move up into a team lead position, which was a frontline supervisor position. And then either from a coach or from a team lead, they would come over to the training organization and be a trainer for a little while, and then ultimately they would go back into the business and continue their career in the call center business. So we weren't hiring people outside of with deep backgrounds in learning. We were hiring people that seemed like they were smart, they could learn fast, and they had good communication skills. But really, we had to teach them everything else. And in that environment, you sort of the way you succeed is through a training program, a culture that sort of creates the values that you want to build in your organization, but also great tools and templates that guide people through the work. And so that's what we invested in, because we felt like, we had raw talent, but actually to create skilled talent was going to be probably a 5 to 10 year play. And like, I'm actually proud when I look back at the organization now. I think they have incredibly good, amazing talent. I think they've upskilled everyone. But to start out with, how do you create an environment in which you can onboard people successfully, you can build the right culture, and you can have the right tools and templates and systems to guide their work?
And in talking about the systems side, how this concept of measuring learning outcomes and measuring learning, especially at the corporate world, seems to be hard. You hear about uh, different taxonomies or evaluation methods or frameworks to do it. In recent conversations I had, it was about putting those frameworks aside and just measuring outcomes at the end of the day. You and I have had conversations where you mentioned that there were no systems in place at Discover Financial from a learning operations perspective, that you actually ended up building some of those as well. Can you tell us a little bit about that and why you had to go that route?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. I mean, there's sort of two separate issues. One is, how do you give people tools, templates, systems to guide their work, and that's actually one of the reasons why you build. At least we decided to build an enterprise solution for learning that would basically take take the entire process from a learning request where someone says, "Hey, I think I need a course or a learning intervention," all the way through from learning consultancy to learning design to learning to development to implementation to actually analysis, and would follow that request all the way through. So we could say, hey, of all the requests we got, we actually turned 17% of them into learning, and of those 17, 16 rolled out, and of those 16 rolled out, we saw demonstrated improvement in efficacy in 14 of them. Like that was the kind of flow we wanted to be able to report on. So yeah, so we built a lot of that. I mean, we had these very disjointed systems, and it occurred to me at some point. I mean, I think it occurred to the entire leadership team that just managing all those handoffs was something that was going to be incredibly time consuming for all of us. And did we want to spend our time managing all those separate handoffs, or did we automate that much as possible and spend our time really focused on the things that leaders of a learning organization can do, like advocating within the business for a set of learning interventions that are going to actually have long-term impact to the company. So we wanted to do the latter, and that's one of the reasons why we tried to automate as much of the process as possible.
Interesting. And requests, where did they come from? Were these corporate strategic initiatives that turned into requests where then you had to prioritize budget around or just people, resources, and time around? Did you also support requests coming from business lines from a performance perspective? How did you balance the two together if you were doing both?
Yeah, it's a great question. So we ran all of learning for the entire company, but the majority of our headcount and our resources were tied up in call center training. So I would say sort of 70% of our resources were allocated to ensuring that the call centers had, the right people at the right place at the right time. And so that took up an enormous amount of effort. And most of the requests we got from the business came through individual area managers, department managers who would say, "Hey, I'm launching a new strategy. I'm going to need learning to align to that strategy." Or, I'd like to teach all of our agents negotiation skills because I think they lack negotiation finesse. And so those are the kind of requests we got from our call center partners. We would typically every year look at the strategic initiatives for the company and try to align sort of 30% of our budget towards building the right learning to support those initiatives. Now, if I had it to do over again, I probably would have tried to ratchet that up to 50%, like really make a significant effort in those things that were going to drive the company. I think for most learning leaders, just getting out from under the ongoing commitments of existing learning programs to focus on the new things that are going to drive future performance is an enormously challenging enterprise. And having stepped away from Discover for a few years now and looking back on it, I think that's actually something I would do differently. That I would do everything I could to unwind as many of the learning programs that we had under our responsibility to invest in new learning programs that were more aligned to company strategic priorities.
Yeah, it's always tough to balance the two we find, and to have the insights into what the right balance is as well from a demand and supply perspective, right? Just as an L&D team, um, often headcount or resources can become a bottleneck to actually being able to achieve all. Um, sometimes we hear this concept of learning advisory boards helping to determine what gets prioritized. Sometimes learning leaders will have a seat at the C-suite, to have that close alignment with the stakeholders. In your perspective, what has worked the best to get that feedback loop going from the business to knowing what to prioritize when and how?
Well, I was very lucky in that I had, my role was elevated. So I reported to the CHRO, and the CHRO was a member of the C-suite. So that gave me entree to the C-suite, and I felt like I had a seat at the table most of the time. I think all those other areas, I think, for example, the Learning Advisory Board is really a great approach if you have a federated model where you have a centralized L&D team, but most of the resources are distributed throughout the company. So I think the way in which you get that seat at the table really has to depend on the way learning is organized at the company. For me, I felt like we had a seat at the table, and that was something that I was incredibly grateful for. I actually think that was one of the delights of the role, is that I had such proximity to the C-suite that I really got to see how the executive leaders of a company work together to drive the company. And so that was something that I never would have learned had I not been in that role. But I think in retrospect, going back to it, I probably would have just pushed harder to just allocate more of our money to the things that really would make a difference in the future. Typically, the work that's really future focused in a company has very few organizational backers. I mean, the people that are really committed to, the things that are bleeding edge for the company, just you don't have a lot of people that are just every day or just sort of trying to mobilize people around those objectives. Usually it's maybe it's the CEO, maybe not. In the environment that I was in, I think the vast majority of the officers of the company were really focused on day-to-day work, and that makes it very hard to pivot and put resources behind the things that are going to make a difference in the future.
Understood. And given that you worked with the C-suite, were they interested in measuring the learning outcomes and what that meant to the business? Part of leadership is being able to tell stories, talking about books. Like one of my favorite books is called Tell to Win, and it teaches you about telling stories. Did you have to help shape up stories to show return of learning investment or ROI at any time? I mean, how did that work? What was important as a CLO to show back to, your counterparts at that C-suite table, the impact that your org had on the rest of the business?
Yeah, so I mean, storytelling is, I would say storytelling is the most important skill that a head of learning or a head of any function can have. I mean, humans have evolved to learn and to remember from stories. And actually, we're not optimally designed to understand data. I mean, as a species, we try to do it. We do it better than other species, but still, it's until you have a story that wraps up that data and makes sense of the data, it's very hard to interpret data in just as an isolated piece of information. So, I think the thing is that we were focused on data, but we had to embed all that data in a set of stories, and the stories we told were around the most important story we told actually had to do with the people who joined the company and moved into the call center. And the reason why is just our legacy. We started as a call center training organization and grew to take over all of learning within the company. And so we built a set of scorecards, and essentially what we did is we measured the first month of performance after graduating from our onboarding program. That was sort of that was sort of the main measurement that we did, and we had probably not, somewhere between 10 and 15 different types of jobs they would do from customer service to sales to collections, etc. And basically, what we would do is we would measure people's performance in the first month on the job after graduating from our training program and compare that to the average of their tenured peers. And so we were very proud that on average, our graduates were performing at somewhere between about 93% and 105% of the performance of the tenured peer. So in many cases, we graduated whole classes that were outperforming the average tenured call center agent. And so we could put that in a story, and I think that was a story of like the success of the person who comes in to Discover, not really knowing what their career was going to be like, and being able to start their job with a leg up on everything that they were doing and feel confident and feel secure in their employment. And that was the story that we were able to tell. I mean, with the backing of data. I think that data around the performance of call center agents and their month of their work is not really analogous to many other job roles, especially many other white collar job roles. I mean, just the nature of what it means to succeed in most jobs is not as clearly defined and measured as call center agents. So we couldn't really have scorecards and dashboards that would say, this training delivered this amount of EPS. I mean, that just was not realistic. But we could tell the stories around where we saw our training programs making a difference. And then we would pull in anecdotal feedback. We pull in other types of data to sort of make that case. And honestly, I think when you talk about the challenges of defining of allocating a performance improvement to training, especially when the training is on something that has a real long tail payoff, like critical thinking skills or effective problem solving. It's very, very difficult to have a numerical dashboard that shows how you've moved the company forward.
And that also makes sense. Were there any types of dashboards that were requested or asked about you that aligned to budget at all?
I have to think about budget. I don't think so. I don't remember any budgetary dashboards that we had to do. I mean, there's Stanford sort of standard corporate reporting that we had to do, but there wasn't anything specific. What we wanted to do, and we never managed to get this done. And it was just we tried for years actually to manage all the content in our learning management system and tag everything and sort of really understand where all the content was. I think a lot of companies struggle with this. What I really wanted to do is be able to have a dashboard that showed the learning investment per employee and be able to deliver that by location, by level in the company, by role, and be able to say, look, who are we investing most in terms of learning, and where should our investment be targeted? And really, the reason behind this is just anecdotally, I knew that we poured the vast majority of our money into new employees joining our call center and our executives. And it was like this barbell distribution where just right in the middle, we really didn't have a lot for people in the middle. And I wanted to be able to show that to the C-suite and say, this is how we're investing in our employees. I think that there's a better way of doing this where we should have a more egalitarian spend and we should actually invest more in people in the middle. So here's my plan for doing that. I think that would have been really effective. We never ended up getting the dashboard ready, and it just was it was one of those things that you bash your head against the wall for a long time. It seems like it should be easy, but it was actually really difficult.
No, it's really hard to piece the data together on the learning side of things with operations to outcomes and whatnot. But this was really insightful, John. We really appreciate having you on the episode. I know that your work remains to be carried forward with your consulting company, Corvantus. And so, really appreciate these insights and excited what our audience can do with these to apply it to their own work as well. Thank you.
Ryan, it was my pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks for tuning in to this series. For more information and content on LearnOps, please like, share, and subscribe. Visit getsynapse.com to learn more about our operations platform.